Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you so much for joining ICNC for another webinar in our academic webinar series. We are so excited to have the speakers we have here for you today and to dive into what they have to share. Today's program is entitled Prison Hunger Strikes: How Prisoners Weaponize Their Lives to Win Dignity. This is a very fascinating topic, and I cannot wait for what our presenters have for us and also for the discussion that will unfold afterward. You're welcome to follow along on Twitter as well. You can find us at Civil Resistance. You'll see the handles for the authors there too, or you can search or participate in the discussion with hashtag ICNC webinars. This presentation today is coming off of the newly released ICNC Press monograph, Prison Hunger Strikes in Palestine, a Strategic Perspective. This started as a proposal from the authors into doing a new study looking at the role and the ways and the history and the strategy and the theory and practice of people who are incarcerated, who want to wield power in what is very constrained conditions. And the study really uncovered a range of options in planning and preparing for this. We saw it as a much needed area of research, and it's also something that has culminated in a real bridging between the academic world and the practitioner world. And so as a listener, whether you are an activist, a family member of someone incarcerated, someone in an NGO, or a scholar yourself, we think that we have something really potent and powerful for you here today. The authors did over 25 interviews, multiple interviews with over 25 different people, the bulk of them being actual hunger strikers themselves, formerly incarcerated or family members of those incarcerated, primarily in Palestine, but also from other countries. This was paired with desk research into hunger strikers of Kurdish, Irish, South African, and British backgrounds to give a really full picture of what this world and this strategic choice looks like. The study itself, which is now available for free download, it covers the political and historical backdrop of prison hunger strikes in Palestine. And so if you are not well adept at Palestinian history over the last 60, 70 years, that is applied for you, so you are still able to jump into the theme. Covers the theory and practice. It deals with questions like, is this self-harm? It breaks the binary conceptions of resistance by looking at the idea of the weaponization of life. It compares collective and individual hunger strikes. It looks at the actual process of striking from preparations and planning all the way to the negotiations that come at the end stage of a strike. It looks at the idea of repression. What shape does that take within a prison? And how do strikers respond to acts of repression? And then it evaluates the efficacy of hunger striking within Palestinian hunger striking history. And leaves us with lessons for allies, for the general public, but especially for people who are hunger striking or plan to hunger strike. And so with that said, I'd like to turn it, well, before I turn it over, let me introduce our speakers today. We are joined by Malaka Mohammed Shwaikh. She's a Palestinian academic from the Gaza Strip based at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, where she teaches and researches prisons as spaces of power, resistance, and peace building. She's the author of several works at the intersection of prison resistance and power, including Dynamics of Prison Resistance, Hunger Strikes by Palestinian Political Prisoners in Israeli Prisons, Engendering Hunger Strikes, Palestinian Women in Israeli Prisons, and most recently, Prison Periods, Bodily Resistance to Gendered Control. She finds purpose and joy in giving back to the community and being involved in social justice work. Her most recent and ongoing project since 2021 is Freelancers in Gaza with Candice Amani to connect freelancers in Gaza with clients around the world and provide them with tailored mentorship. Our other speaker today and the co-author of the study is Rebecca Ruth Gould, who is the author of numerous works at the intersection of aesthetics and politics, including Writers and Rebels, the literature of insurgency in the Caucasus, the Persian prison poem, Sovereignty and the Political Imagination, and most recently, Erasing Palestine, Free Speech and Palestinian Freedom. Together with Malaka Shwaikh, she is the author of The Palestine Exception to Academic Freedom, intertwined stories from the front lines of UK-based Palestine activism in Biography and Interdisciplinary Quarterly, which brought together their shared interests relating to Palestinian liberation. She is Professor, Islamic World and Comparative Literature at the University of Birmingham, where she directs Global Lit Project. We are so happy to have the two of you with us today. I'll turn it over to you now, and I look forward to hearing what you have to share. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bruce. It's so lovely to be here. I hope everyone is doing well, enjoying the spring, light and warmth. Yeah, thank you so much for the ICNC as well for their support from day one. It has been a joy to work with all of you, with the team. And I'm also super excited that some of them are with us today. Some of the team that we've worked with are with us today to see the project and how it has evolved. So the way that we're going to be doing this is I'm going to be speaking for about 10 to 15 minutes. I'm going to time myself so the timer starts. And then Rebecca is going to be also speaking for 10 to 15 minutes. I'm going to be speaking more or less about the personal aspect of hunger strikes and how I became involved and became interested and committed to the issue and the topic of hunger strikes in Palestine, but also in other contexts. And then Rebecca is going to be speaking about the transnational aspect of hunger strikes. So what I'm going to be doing, just to make things a little bit more fun and engaging, I'm going to be sharing a screen now with some pictures. So just bear with me for a few seconds while I do that. Okay, that should work. Do you see that, Bruce?
Yes, it's coming through. Great.
Amazing. Okay. Okay, so I'm gonna just put that in here because it's easier. Okay, so this is, of course, a work that we've been working on for a few years now. It involves a lot of interviews, like Bruce rightly mentioned, it involves multiple interviews with 25 people that we have met in different parts of the world. But the focus has been Palestine. So prisoners and hunger strikers within Palestine, or who are Palestinian and have been deported to other parts of the world. Before I get into the presentation, I think it would be nice just to speak a little bit more about the artwork that you can see on the screen here. And this is an artwork by a Palestinian young artist who is actually a student in her last year of university in Gaza. Her name is Mohammed. And she painted this amazing artwork for us of kind of like three little artwork that shows the journey of a hunger striker from hunger strike to freedom, starting from the first kind of picture to my left, which is the prison uniform, that brown uniform with Hebrew words, and then that kind of like basically that sign of not eating, which refers to hunger strikes. And then the picture in the middle is of solidarity and activism happening outside the prison within Palestine, but also outside Palestine to support that prisoner who is on hunger strike. And then the last one is of freedom, and that sun that you can see in the hand of that person refers, or Hiba understand that as kind of freedom for that hunger striker or achievement of their demand. Okay, so I actually got involved in hunger strikes activism when I was still in the Gaza Strip. These are pictures from, I don't know, maybe 2011, 2012. And I remember kind of being involved in this salt and water activism work where, as you can see here, a lot of like really young activists and young students from the Gaza Strip would come together and, you know, talk about what's going on in prison and doing some like little protest outside, mostly the ICRC, the International Red Cross kind of building in the Gaza Strip. And this is how I became involved and became passionate about the topic of hunger strikes, but also prisons in general. And I remember I ended up, you know, doing my work, my master's and my PhD on prisons and on hunger strikes. So this is a picture from my Viva in May 2019. And I remember when I had my scholarship for my PhD, kind of like the panel where you have to discuss whether you should have the scholarship or not. I remember Ilan Pepe here, who was my first, who was one of the people in the panel, but ended up becoming my first supervisor. He said, but you can't travel to Palestine. It's hard, it's dangerous, and all, indirectly kind of pushing me away from doing field work in Palestine. So it has been hard for me as a Palestinian to go and conduct interviews in Palestine. But the flip side of this is the fact that I have been able to travel to other parts of the world and meeting with ex-prisoners and hunger strikers who opened my eyes in so many ways to the transnational aspect of resistance and solidarity within prisons, how prisoners in Ireland, for example, have learned from the Palestinian case, how in 1981, a prisoner or someone from Ireland got in touch with prisoners in Palestine just to see what they have done differently that they can learn from them about hunger strikes in that context. And that was before 1981, which was the major hunger strike that exists in the Irish history, when 10 men, of course, died, the first one of whom was Bobby Sands. What I find fascinating about the Irish hunger strike is that within the history of Ireland, you will see that hunger strikes and fasting are so deeply rooted in their culture and religion and history. Back in the day, thousands of years ago, when someone does injustice against someone, that someone is going to fast against their door until justice prevails for them. And of course, allowing this person to die in front of that person's door is a shame in so many ways, and they would try their best not to let them die because of the shame attached to it. But still, the Irish person and the Irish community think that it's so important to consult with the Palestinian hunger strikers because of how much achievement and how much they have achieved in so many ways in the last since 1968, which is the kind of like the year that we trace the first hunger strike to since the occupation of Palestine. Some of the first hunger strikers, or some of the first people that I actually got to know about their hunger strikes in Palestine were these two pictured here in the screen. The first one of whom on the right is Khader Adnan, and the second is Hana Shalabi, both of whom actually started individual hunger strikes around 2011, 2012. And they were kind of like leader and pioneers in actually leading individual hunger strikes around that time. Even though there have been other individual hunger strikes before, but their action around that time actually led into hundreds and hundreds of individual hunger strikes within the Palestinian context. And of course, I find myself, trying to do as much as I can to write about their action. And of course, as I said before, ended up doing my master's and PhD on the topic of hunger strikes. One other person that actually also went or embarked on hunger strike in around 2013 was Samir Isawi, who ended up becoming the longest surviving hunger striker in the Palestinian history. And I'm trying to see the time, I'm good. Samir Isawi was one of those prisoner who actually had an impact on me to kind of embark on this journey of writing about hunger strikes and prisoners. I'm more than happy to expand on his case as well in the question and answer session. But it has been super interesting to see how much support Samir has gotten, how that support not only helped him or support him in his action, but support other prisoners around him in Israeli prisons, Palestinian prisoners in Israeli prisons, but also prisoners around the world. We did use a lot of conceptions, and I'm gonna try to make sure that these concepts that I'm gonna explain are as accessible as possible for all of us, given that the attendees are coming from different backgrounds and not all of us are academic. But one of the main concepts that we kind of focus on in our book is that hunger strike is not only about bodies, but also about souls. And this is why you see that sometimes prisoners go for hunger strike even though their bodies are weak enough and fragile enough and vulnerable enough. So there is the importance of soul that is so central to the action of hunger strike. But the other thing is dignity. Prisoners that we interviewed and people more generally that we interviewed in Palestine and outside Palestine have centered the importance of dignity for their action, that it's dignity or death. And this is why they have taken this kind of last resort action so that they can regain dignity. But the other thing is agency over their body. And this is something that that's, like I've mentioned before, it's the last resort because they've tried everything that they can within the prison context. And everything has failed them. So they have no other choice but to use their body so that they can make a statement and regain this agency and regain this control over their body and their life. And this is the opposite of necropolitics of Mpambe, one of the scholars that exists within academia, but the opposite of this is necro-resistance. So just kind of unpack both of these concepts. So necropolitics is more or less about the state or the government or a controlling body having control over your life and your death. Necro-resistance is the opposite of this, and it means that you actually take control over your body and over your life and over your death. So through hunger strike, prisoners take control over their life and over their death when they decide that they're not gonna go and eat or drink. And this, in a way, is a statement, a political statement saying that I actually can take control over when I can die and when I can live. We also use the concept of weaponization of lives, which is a concept used first by scholar Bano Bergo. By saying that the prisoner weaponized their lives, we're actually pushing against the binary of violence and nonviolent resistance, which we think is dehumanizing, and we can expand on this a little bit more as well in the question and answer session. But the other thing that we think about why we actually push against the binary of violent and nonviolent resistance is that this is the choice of the prisoner and the interviewees that that when we have that discussion with them and ask them how you would actually conceptualize the action of hunger strike, they push against violent and nonviolent resistance tactics as a conception for their action. And finally, prison resistance and solidarity travel around the world. It's very interesting to see through this project and other projects that Rebecca and I are working on how prison solidarity and resistance are not confined to one particular region, but they are transnational and international. And I'm gonna just end with the story, or before I end with the story, it's this picture here in the middle is a picture of Palestinian women going for a protest and saying here in the poster you can see Nafha, which is an Israeli prison in the south of the country, and then H Block, which is a prison in Ireland, and then they say one struggle. I think, if I'm not mistaken, this is a picture just after the death of Bobby Sands, and Palestinian women came in the street to kind of protest his death, but also to send a solidarity message to the people of Ireland around that time. And of course, I'm happy also to expand on the South African Palestinian connection. As you can see here, the picture of Nelson Mandela and his autobiography that has been smuggled out of the prison by another prisoner, and how that autobiography as well has been read by other prisoners around the world, but more specifically Marwan Barghouti, who is a Palestinian prisoner. But just to end with the story of Angela Davis in I think it was early 1970s, maybe 1970 or 1971, Angela Davis, this American civil rights, African-American civil rights activist who received a letter around that time from Palestinian prisoner in Nafha prison that I've just mentioned here, which is in the south of the country. Angela Davis, that letter was written on a scrap of paper, signed by a good number of Palestinian prisoner. It was smuggled out of Nafha prison by someone. Another person smuggled that letter from outside the prison to the United States, and then a third person smuggled that letter from the United States to inside Angela Davis' prison cell. A few years ago, Angela Davis visited Palestine, and more specifically Jerusalem, with a group of indigenous women and Black women from the United States. And she was talking about meeting an old man who approached her and said that I remember, or I've heard that you've received a letter in the 70s from Palestinian prisoners who shared support and showed solidarity with you. And she said, yes. And the man said, I was one of those who actually signed that letter. And when she was speaking about this, she was saying how overwhelming or how happy she is that actually both of them are still supportive of prison kind of like struggle for justice, and it's inspiring in so many ways to see how these letters are not only meaningless kind of papers, but they actually raise the morale of the prisoners when the prison as a structure is there to cut prisoners from the rest of the world, and kind of tell them directly or indirectly that there is no one that actually care about you. But then you have those letters being smuggled and traveling to inside your prison cell to tell you that people are actually thinking about you. So that's it. Thank you. Rebecca now?
Yes. Oh, okay. It automatically goes to me. Wonderful. So yes, Malaka, thank you so much. That was, I think, a wonderful summary of our book. And I also just want to say, thank Bruce and Steve and the whole ICNC team for the many years of support that went into the creation of this monograph. And also specifically Malaka, I've learned so much from you. I think you're an inspiration to everyone. So thank you so much for that. I'm just going to kind of step back a little bit from Malaka's examples and reflect a little bit on the sort of the transnational dimensions, which I think she already underscored, especially with her final story, but the transnational dimensions of hunger striking. And that I'll just also say that I think that was one thing that really impressed me, given that, based during our years of research into the topic, because if you think about the physical position of prisoners, you know, the sort of from a material perspective, the lack of agency they have, by definition, their freedom is constrained, and yet their acts in the context of hunger striking have this ability to traverse international borders in a really amazing way. Yeah, another feature I think that maybe might be worth sort of just mentioning too, is what all of the examples, which I'll sort of briefly run through in a second, in addition to the sort of similarities you can see among the different types of hunger striking in different contexts, you could also see a similarity of the state's response. And I think you can learn a lot about the carceral state from a comparative study of hunger striking in different geographies. And also, I think it is worth mentioning that this is probably, you know, there are quite a few studies, scholarship on hunger striking from specific geographies. Probably each of the geographies we look at, there's some sort of resource that talks about hunger striking in those contexts, but truly comparative studies are rare. And we believe this is probably the first really systematic attempt to look at hunger striking in all of its global manifestations. So as Malaka mentioned, actually, you know, the practice of hunger striking has a kind of continuity with even medieval practices in Ireland. As Malaka did mention this example, that there was the legal code of medieval Ireland specified that as a kind of penance for crime or asking for forgiveness, or if someone is demanding something from someone who they think is has persecuted them, they can go on a hunger strike, and it's a way of kind of making a political assertion. So that was part of the political structure of medieval Ireland. It was very much embedded in the culture. And moving forward, you know, several centuries in early 20th century Britain, of course, the suffragettes made hunger striking, puts hunger striking really at the center of their political praxis. And you can see continuities also, again, in the response of the state, because many of with contemporary times, because many of these suffragettes were subjected to force feeding, just as, say, you find in Guantanamo Bay, prisoners who went on hunger strike were subjected to force feeding, which we discuss that in the monograph. It's important to note that can actually be a very dangerous practice. I mean, it can be very permanently damage the internal organs of prisoners when they're forced, when tubes are placed inside of them, and some kind of liquid or food is forcibly entered their body. That's dangerous. But because apparently the prisoner agents are threatened by hunger strikes, they feel like that's a risk worth taking, often in many contexts. So particularly in Palestine, Israeli prisons, and in Guantanamo Bay, that's really well documented. And yeah, so you could sort of draw a line going from Ireland and throughout history for centuries to the British suffragettes, to Palestine, as Malaka mentioned in detail. And there was, I think, a mutual reciprocity of influence in terms of the hunger striking that was taking place during the 1980s in those geographies, to South Africa, to the Kurds in Turkey, and that's the subject of Banu Bargu's monograph, and to Iran also. That's I think a area hunger striking in Iran. We talk a little bit about, you know, not in extensive detail, but that's one area that really deserves quite a bit of attention. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. To Guantanamo Bay. So that shows that there's hunger striking is a way of communicating, that prisoners have for communicating across the world with each other, and also most particularly, I think, with the world itself. So one thing that often accompanies hunger strikes, which we analyze in the monograph in detail, are letters to the world, right? There are often these public open letters that a prisoner writes to accompany their hunger strike. So in the case of Samir Isawi, there are several letters he wrote, that sort of autobiographical accounts of why he was in prison, why his imprisonment is unjust. And those circulated in many different languages across social media, and really made a difference in terms of shaping a kind of international perception of his experience and of the Palestinian prisoners' experience. And I think you see a similar phenomenon in Iran. I'm just going to briefly read from an open letter by the prisoner who died while on a hunger strike, Iranian prisoner named Shwaikh Zamani in 2015. He was a trade unionist and bus driver, and he was imprisoned simply because he supported workers' rights, and he went on a hunger strike. He was imprisoned for many years. And but what's important, I think, about his the way in which he positioned his activism in prison is that he really saw it as a kind of transnational enterprise. It wasn't, I mean, it wasn't local. It was in dialogue with the oppressive regimes around the world. So in the open letter that he wrote shortly before his death to sort of all of his, and he was also very, by the way, just you'll see this from the letter, very strongly Marxist, and that was an important part of his conception of struggle. And I think you find that a lot in many of these prison hunger strikers. It's just addressed to an international audience, and so he thanks everyone for support, compassion, and selfless assistance. So I'm just reading from his letter here. I'm trying to abbreviate it just so I get a sentence or two. He said, to quote the letter, this is from the last paragraph: "I suggest that with joint effort, centers of common organization of global and regional, especially in Turkey, the Arabic countries, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iran are formed to cooperate and conduct a program of sustained, leading in conscious class struggle. Especially to assist us in creating national trade unions and workers' organizations to establish links with international organizations." And he ends by saying, "Long live the internationalist unity of the workers of the world. The working class will be victorious." And this was written, I think, a few months before he died of starvation. He was just allowed to starve in the Iranian prisons. And of course, that pattern of hunger striking has become even more important in the recent protests. There's the pictures were circulating of a protester who was in prison named Farhad Maysami, who again starved, was allowed to reach the brink of starvation. And it's interesting, in terms of the comparative analysis, of course, some states are more willing to let themselves be portrayed as sort of brutal oppressors than others. So Iran's an example of a state that sort of seems, I guess, doesn't so much fear, being seen as an oppressor. Their prisoners do starve to death, whereas, say, in the United States, the very, force feeding. There's an idea that prisoners shouldn't suffer or don't suffer. Of course, that's not true, but there's a different threshold of tolerance for the persecution of prisoners. So that means, what that means is that different types of hunger strikes can be more effective in different contexts than others. And yeah, so you see, I think, as I said, you can learn a lot about the kind of the mentality or the techniques of the state from studying hunger strikes. And yeah, I think those are the main points I wanted to make. Just that I think by reading the monograph, you'll come away with a sense that although they are in prison, hunger strikes show the example of hunger strikes, the history of hunger strikes, have made a difference, both in terms of prison conditions, but also in terms of the very causes that put prisoners in the prisons in the first place. Now, they're not always successful, of course, like any struggle, but they show the power of people who are confined to their cells. And that's kind of remarkable achievement. So thanks so much for hopefully reading and listening. And I think I'm done. Is Bruce Sager.
Thank you so much. Fascinating, and a topic that needs so much more exposition in the public sphere, right? And this book here is a remarkable first step toward a broader understanding of what that is. I want to open the floor for our attendees to ask questions. If you'd like to ask a question, you can raise your hand and I can unmute you and you can introduce yourself and ask your question over the air, or you could type a question into the Q&A box and we will read your question before our presenters will tackle them. While you are collecting your thoughts and writing questions, I'm going to start with a couple questions of my own for the two of you to answer. And the first is, I want to better understand when is it, or why is it, or how is it that people who are incarcerated choose hunger striking as their tactic of choice? Is it for normal specific ends, or is it a range of things? And then as a second question, building off of that, what is the lever of change that they are pressing on when they choose this? What is the mechanism?
Rebecca, do you want me to go ahead?
I might add something, but you can go ahead. Yeah, you can start.
Sure. Okay. Okay. Really brilliant questions. Thank you so much, Bruce. So, really briefly, when, why, and how prisoners kind of like embark on hunger strike, and why. I think there's like one thing that I want to mention here, that it's not necessarily their choice. It's that they have no other option but to go into and embark on this, act that can cost them their lives, which is something that we've seen in Ireland in 1981 when 10 men died out of hunger strike. What I find really interesting in the Israeli case, though, and in the Palestinian case, is the fact that no prisoner actually died out of hunger strike. It was always force feeding that killed prisoners, and the Israeli government and authorities always kind of point and paint that force feeding is there to protect you. But the reality is force feeding is there and it has killed you before. But the other thing that is so important to mention on the second question that you've asked, which is again a brilliant question, what they kind of rely on when it comes to their action. There are so many things to mention here, but one of which is the solidarity action that exists outside the prison. Transnational solidarity from an activism from other contexts around the world is also quite important. Their family is central to their action. The lawyer, like that contact with the outside world is quite important for them. And yeah, I mean, legal action more particularly as well can be helpful in some context, but that's what comes to my mind. I'm sure Rebecca has other questions, and I can see that there are other questions in the chat as well.
Yeah, I can briefly respond as well. I think Malaka gave a comprehensive answer, but I would just say, I think, as much as you can compare these, as much as there's commonality among different prison strikers, I think that question about motivation and demands is where you see the starkest differences. I think in sort of context of, say, Israeli prisons, which is one we focused on a lot, they're asking for things like vegetation rights. There are very concrete demands around prison conditions. In the Iranian case, from what I've seen, I think because, as I think my examples illustrated, there's less hope of like a concrete success. I mean, the prisoners who go on strike are likely to die in many cases. So in a sense, their demands are very large. Like, just to quote the demand, I'm quoting from a letter written by Farhad Meisami, who I think it was just a few weeks ago died in prison, and he starved to death. I mean, you could see from pictures what happened. And he says, "I will still insist on my 3 demands of stopping the execution of protesters, releasing 6 political prisoners, and stopping mandatory hijab." And that didn't happen, but I think, he made a very, very powerful statement that will have an impact over the long term. So there's just an incredible variation.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. It's fascinating to me, the idea of being pushed to do something that you don't have a choice of, and yet that action can be seen as maybe the ultimate act of agency, right? Claiming ownership over your own body and your own life. I see we have a raised hand from John Johns. John, I'm going to call on you. Would you take a moment to introduce yourself and then ask your question?
Hi, good afternoon, or good morning. Actually, I'm in Arizona, so we're still on West Coast time. I had a question. I've been a longtime member of Amnesty International, and I actually wrote a question, so it's in the chat box. But they have always relied, or the essence of that organization, the culture of the organization, is letter writing on behalf of political prisoners, prisoners of conscience. And so I think they call it the mobilization of shame. So my question is, your presentation is really illuminating. It's really new for me. I was very familiar, I'm relatively familiar with the Irish hunger strikes with Bobby Sands. And so the Amnesty point of view would be you write letters to the prison officials or you write letters to Margaret Thatcher, and then she's moved to make a change. No, nothing would move Margaret Thatcher, humanity or compassion. But my question is that concept of the mobilization of shame, does it now come in conflict with the idea of agency for prisoners, for prisoners, prisoners of conscience making a really critical statement?
Rebecca, do you want to go first this time, or shall I go first?
That's a really complicated question. Yeah, I think if you have some response, I'd sort of meditate on it a bit. Or yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think this is a really good question. Thank you so much, John. There are so many things that come to my mind. One of which is that there are different types of prisons. So there are authoritarian prisons, colonial prisons, etc. And I think the way that we should deal with all prisons are similar, but not necessarily the same, not identical. If we're dealing with colonial prisons, for example, it's hard to send a letter to the prison authorities and expect that they're gonna respond positively about a hunger striker who is part of the colonized population in that in that region. So I think letters can be helpful, but not in all instances that can come to my mind now. I think we need to make sure that power structures and power dynamics are pushed to be kind of we need to flatten that power structure that exists in the world. And I think this is what we need to kind of push for. And letter is part of that, but I don't think that it's necessarily very helpful. And I think this is not only about Amnesty, it's about other international organizations that are working to support prisoners and hunger strikes and activists around the world, the kind of language that they usually use. I mean, one of the things that we use in the monograph is the language of resilience. Expecting prisoners or people going through struggles and injustice to kind of cope with this injustice instead of tackling the root causes that actually force them to be resilient. So that language can be very dehumanizing because it strips the person of their basic human aspects of life, including vulnerability and fragility. Just going there to cry in the corner of their bedroom when they want to, right? So that is also important and part of the human characteristic of any individual in the world that we live in, and that should be embraced, I guess.
Can I follow up, not with a question, but with a comment? That seems, how do I put that? It's I don't want to say it's counterintuitive, but I think it's an important thing that we on the outside need to take into consideration. Should we show solidarity? And I think it's almost like we need an instruction manual on how to do it, because if I hear you right, you can really undermine the prisoner's goal, the prisoner's agency, and with good intentions.
That's very good food for thought.
I can just add, sort of add a little bit to what Malaka is saying. I mean, I think the other limitation of a lot of these letter writing campaigns is that there is a tendency to, I think, focus on, say, celebrities or certain prisoners who have more visibility, like in the Iranian context. I mean, dual nationals, for example, people who have some connection with America or the United States tend to get a lot more coverage, and even probably by organizations such as Amnesty, than, say, obscure I don't know, factory workers, who may not even speak English. And so I think that's also a big limitation that international campaigns need to overcome, is not just focusing on the celebrity prisoners.
Yes, very wise. We have a typed question from one attendee. Saeed writes, what challenges and data collection did you face in doing this research?
Yeah, Rebecca, or shall I go ahead?
So just repeat the question one more time. What challenges?
Yeah, the challenges specifically with data collection that you faced.
Well, I think Malaka kind of covered the challenges of accessing participants. I think there's also perhaps even the most important question is sort of safety for people and speakers, not just accessing, but when they give, many prisoners are happy to speak, but sometimes they are putting themselves, or ex-prisoners could be putting themselves at risk or their family at risk, and so they are taking a risk just by speaking, and how to kind of protect them and honor, if they do choose to put themselves at risk, how do you honor that risk? And so I think there's like the human, that human aspect probably is the most difficult. Well, also, I mean, I think as I mentioned briefly, a big part of our research is to do with letters, and some of these letters were like written on scraps of, say, cigarette paper, toilet paper, what the ways that the strikes were organized. Now, obviously, a lot of that's lost, so that's another kind of archival problem, right? The actual evidence in many cases isn't extant. But Malaka, do you have more? I'm sure.
I think what Rebecca mentioned is very important. The other thing that I want to mention is the kind of perception that people have of you as a Palestinian doing this research on Palestinian prisoners. There's always the objectivity question that comes to the surface, like how can you be a Palestinian and working on Palestinian prisoners? Are you objective? How do you actually kind of detach yourself from the subject? And this is not something that I often get as a Palestinian working on Palestinian prisoners, but also working on Palestine. Sometimes there is always a question of objectivity, which is sad to see in academia, but sadly exists. And then you see the other, like you see, I don't know, someone who's not Palestinian or someone from the global north, a white middle-class man having the access and the privilege to visit Palestine whenever they want and do research for, I don't know, a couple of weeks or a couple of months and come out being expert, being given that platform to speak about Palestine because they have been there. While of course, as a Palestinian or as Palestinian academics or as academics often from the global south, they don't have that privilege. So I think, that's also one of the challenges that comes to my mind.
That's very insightful. And I think there's a lot to be said there about cultural differences in what knowledge is and how it's constituted and whether it's rooted in externality or the internal experience. So I appreciate your thoughts on that. We have many other written questions. Linda writes, I would like more discussion about the non-binary nature of violence, non-violence.
Do you want to begin?
Tell me how you two see it. I know, in the early chapters of your book, you discuss sort of theoretical framing and you engage with this idea. So please explain your understanding of this.
I can kind of like very briefly say that the idea of this binary viewpoint itself, as a Palestinian myself, I feel, and as someone who spoke with a number of prisoners, not only in Palestine, but also outside Palestine, there is the understanding from my interviewees that this kind of viewpoint has roots in the colonialist narrative of violence kind of being equated with barbarism and non-violence being equated with a passive role on the part of the oppressed. And in the monograph, we said that this kind of passive role dehumanized the hunger strikers, because hunger strikers, we think, are not passive, but they are active participants. When a hunger strike is conducted, of course, it's so important to keep in mind, like all other organized and active political protests, hunger strikes or hunger strikers have political objectives that they want to achieve, power structure that they want to challenge, and alternative ones that they want to create. So this binary does dehumanize, I think, the roles of hunger strikers. I think Rebecca may also have other thoughts on here, but this is what comes to my mind in response to the question.
Yeah, I think we had quite even years of really interesting discussions on this topic. I mean, it was really a productive question. I think the definition of violence. I mean, I think the first thing to say is just like, it's relative, right? What is violent? If you're in prison and a state is like chaining you to whatever it is, I mean, or even just forcing you inside a cell, that's an act of violence as well, right? And so in the state usually even in terms of classical political theory defines violence, right? So it's not a kind of neutral situation, and yeah, so that's why the kind of the the state also, the organizations, the entities that imprison people, often there's a pattern of sort of denying that they can be political prisoners, right? So in the Israeli context, they wouldn't say that someone who goes to jail for protesting against the Israeli occupation is not called a political prisoner, because that's already an admission, that there's some kind of injustice at work. Same thing in the Iranian context, same thing, in the context of apartheid in South Africa. It's a very common phenomenon. So I think we need to think about, who has the power to make these categories, to create these definitions. And hunger striking is an example of a prisoner kind of asserting power, but yeah, in a way that overcomes that binary between violence and nonviolence.
Thank you. We also have a question from John Pascalides in the submissions. John writes, thanks for the talk. Could you elaborate on how the nature of hunger strikes, for example, their efficacy, differs depending on whether they are undertaken inside prison or outside prison?
That's a very good question. I didn't think about this before. Rebecca, do you want to go first? I'm trying to...
Yeah, I agree. It's important and also challenging. I think maybe the most powerful hunger strikes are those that are both, right? In other words, collective hunger strikes involving people in prison and outside of prison in solidarity with hunger strikers within. Often, yeah, the hunger strikers within prison are probably going to be better attuned to what prisoners need, what the actual demands are on the ground, and so they can mobilize in that context more effectively. But again, every hunger strike, really, I think you can categorically say, is a kind of message to the world. So when there's prison hunger strikes outside as well, that makes it more powerful. That's the example that occurs to me. That the ones that are both are the most effective.
Yeah, and I'm also thinking in terms of access, it's possible that people embarking on hunger strike outside the prison context are going to have more access to solidarity and support and activism, while prisoners are not necessarily going to have the same kind of privilege of access. Mostly, of course, because the structure that is the prison is set to cut prisoners from the rest of the world and cut their connection and communication with the outside world. So I assume from the research that we've done that prison hunger strikes are going to be harder, more dangerous, and not necessarily as accessible, especially when there are different and a large number of prisoners actually going for hunger strike. It becomes much harder for the outside community to know who is striking, why they're striking for, or what they're striking for, and all such questions become much harder. I see Steve also has a question.
Yes, I wanted to call on Steve next. Steve Chase played a significant role in this publication, and we're so glad you're here, Steve. I'm going to ask you to unmute and please share your question with us.
Great. This is so exciting to see the fruition of this and to have this published. So just kudos to you all. I'm wondering, I have not read the latest version, so I'm wondering what sort of lessons towards the end that you have of what are things that would increase the effectiveness from prisoners doing hunger strikes and how they approach it, as well as external solidarity forces. Did you, in talking with all these folks, did you start getting a sense of, oh, this increases the effectiveness and power of this kind of activity for justice?
Rebecca, do you want to go first?
Okay, yeah. I mean, I could point you. So I'm looking at the pages here, page 95, 96. So towards the end, yeah, we do have a section for activists in solidarity with prison hunger strikers. And I think to go back to the earlier question too from the member of Amnesty International, I guess it's, maybe it's not so much about influencing political leaders who often aren't necessarily interested in justice, but about engaging the media. That's kind of the recurrent theme. And that's, I think, so they do want their message spread. They do want their open letters, prison hunger strikers. I mean, they do want them circulated as widely as possible, translated into as many languages, and just to have an impact. And the most effective channels are not necessarily going to be sort of the ruling political party of the day, but the media, and increasingly, right, the media can affect political outcomes, and that includes in particular social media, I think, which we found is just like incredibly, Facebook and Twitter especially. Not always, but yeah, that's the really, I think, accessible way of making a difference. Framing and yeah, changing the narrative, so often the media may tend to call, there's sort of reflexive tendency to think of Palestinian prisoners as somehow violent in some kind of way, and actually, they're often political prisoners, and sometimes just by not having the right ID, they can be classified as criminals. But but I think if you think about those narratives more carefully, using the messages from prison strikers, then there's a scope for changing the media narrative. So I think that's probably the number one thing, that stood out.
Yeah, I think Rebecca summarized things very clearly. I would maybe add a few more points, one of which is the way that we frame hunger strikers and prisoners. I think it's so important to humanize their experience. Like I've mentioned before, that kind of resilient narrative, for example, and expecting prisoners in specific part of the world to embark on hunger strikes and be fine past 100 days is not necessarily a good way forward, and it's very dehumanizing. So humanizing their experiences, I think, very important. Solidarity is very important as well, not only from their family and group like neighbors and such, but also from outside their countries. So transnational solidarity and activism is quite important and central to the efficiency, to the the effectiveness of hunger strikes, and the effectiveness of prison resistance as well. Media, of course, including social media, like Rebecca rightly mentioned, is quite important, especially that it allows you to, of course, write in different languages. But yeah, I guess the bottom line is to challenge the structure of prisons, because they are violent spaces, and the way they understand prisons is not only as spaces of power, but also of resistance. They are spaces of power because they are there not only to torture and punish prisoners, and many of those are, especially when we speak about colonial prisons, they are oppressed, colonized populations, but the system and the structure itself is violent in how it pushes prisoner to the margin and disconnect them from the rest of the world. But they're also spaces of resistance where prisoners, of course, resist this structure and this system, and try everything that they can do, that they can have and they can do to resist such structure. But yeah, that's what comes to my mind.
Thank you both. We are near the end of our time, so we'll have to cut the discussion off here, even though we have raised hands and more questions. I want to invite participants. If you have questions that have not been answered, please email us. I'll be happy to share them with Rebecca and Malaka. And if you wouldn't mind writing some short answers that we could post on the webinar page, so that we can keep this discussion going just a little bit longer. We're so grateful that you have written this book and that you've done this research and that you have shared some of the key things with us today. I've learned a lot from the two of you over the last couple of years working on this project, and again, sitting in this virtual space with you. So thank you so much for what you've contributed to this world. It's a real gift, and we're grateful for it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thanks to the ICNC as well, and thanks to everyone who attended today. I hope that you have a great day ahead as well.
I want everyone to know that you can download this PDF for free from ICNC's webpage. You can find it at nonviolent-conflict.org, and you can also purchase hard copies from bookshop.org. And here's the email address if you want to write us any follow-up questions, webinar@nonviolent-conflict.org. And you can access the recording of the webinar, and you can find us on Facebook and Twitter at those links. Again, we're so grateful to both of you, and I encourage everyone to follow up this webinar with downloading a copy to really dig deep into this. It really goes on a granular level into what the process of a hunger strike looks like from beginning to end. And I think that that alone, even without all the other parts of the book, is such a contribution to an understanding for those of us who have not been incarcerated or have had family members incarcerated, to have any sort of window into this or foothold into understanding it. So thank you so much for your great contribution, and we look forward to learning more from you in the years to come in all of your academia and research. Thank you to our participants for joining. We're happy that you're here today. Have a good evening.